spot. Kid in a candy store.
Captain, Captain, stop window shopping. The Atlas will do fine.
Mechassault. All one word, no hyphen. Just to tell you how much it means business. My original Xbox is actually in really rough shape right now. The light on the front keeps shifting to all the colors, and the disk drive doesn't open properly, so playing original Xbox games was a bit of a challenge, but I had a real hankering for playing some classic Xbox, and this was one of like the 3 or 4 games I really wanted to play, even though it's an absolute pain to get it to work, and I really wanted to talk about this one. But I think it's important going into this to tell you that I'm not the most well-versed in this series. I can probably limit the total number of facts to this series I know to one hand, and since we have time, let's see if I can. Mechassault is a mostly Xbox exclusive with the exception of a DS spin-off branch of the Mechwarrior series. The Mechwarrior series was a video game branch that was primarily aimed at computer gamers, with the exception of a PS1 and Saturn game that I'm shocked I've never had a chance to play. It was a branch of Battletech. Battletech was a Games Workshop game, which means I will never be able to afford even a single figure because I'm dirt poor. Feel free to hit up the Patreon, support me please. Seriously, please do it. Although I do have a bit of a connection to playing sort of a game with these mechs in it. I mentioned all the way back on Versus Battler, I played a PC game where you ran around as a maze as some mechs. And it was a game called Megatron, and it actually used 2 of the machines from Mechwarrior. I can tell you that the spokes model for this series, primarily from my experience, is the Timberwolf, also known as the Mad Cat, because Attack Computer couldn't decide if its silhouette matched a catapult or a marauder. And I remember when I was a kid, there was a really incredibly bad Battletech cartoon that I remember ended in like the stupidest way imaginable. And you absolutely need to see it. It's hilariously bad and awkward. Go watch the Battletech cartoon. It's amazing. Either way, it should be no surprise to say this, but I'll say it anyway. Kinda like mechs a lot. So games with mechs are a big plus. I mean, I've already talked about Metal Wolf Chaos and the legendarily good Phantom Crash on here. I like games with mechs. And last time I played Mechassault was when I recorded a gameplay video of it many years ago. I was thoroughly impressed with this game then, and having sat down and actually played through in its entirety, you know, it's pretty impressive. I like this game. The story follows you, a captain of a mercenary lance, sort of being sent ahead of the rest of your crew to soften the blow for the rest of your incoming crew, to take out a group that have occupied this planet. However, when you land, everyone you brought with you kinda gets separated and dies in sort of freaky, mysterious ways. And you're left kind of alone, and you, being the only mech warrior, have to kind of go in and take care of everything on your own. But your entire opposition are just guys with guns, and it doesn't seem to be making too much sense, and there are civilians getting caught in the crossfire. And it turns out there's like a huge cult that's trying to take over this world, and they found some lost technology, and it's pretty interesting. Ultimately, your goal is to shut down the guns so that the rest of your mercenary team can land and, you know, help fight back, but you're pretty much entirely on your own against unknown forces the entire time, and it's really fascinating. The story beats come pretty quick, in between using radio messages in every stage, as well as in between cutscenes that kind of show the perspective every now and then of the villain, or, you know, your missing teammates, who are all getting wiped out through mysterious circumstances. It's kind of fascinating to see what happens, and learn where the story goes. I really did appreciate the story, and the characters, for what little you get of them, are well done. You have a villain that ultimately you end up hating. You're fighting a group of people who are actively attacking civilians. And while you are effectively a neutral party as a mercenary, you know, you're getting shot at yourself, so you kind of want to take them out. The villains and your characters are decently enough characterized, I suppose. Although your 2 teammates are just a little kind of generic, honestly. But overall, the story is decent. Now, unlike the Mechwarrior series that Mechassault spins off from, this game is not a simulation. Those games were sort of more simulation focused. You were controlling a big mech and you had to press all the buttons and, you know, monitor all your systems. This is more of a simplified game. It's more of a third-person shooter action style game, which, you know, given the fact it's using the standard Xbox controller and not the monstrosity that came with good old Steel Battalion, makes a lot more sense. It's very simple to control your machine in this game. The left stick controls the leg direction, the right stick controls the torso. Basically, just aim with the right stick, walk with the left stick. It's a very simplified control scheme, it works. You can swap your weapons using the shoulder buttons, and I think you can activate a flare by clicking in the right stick? Honestly, I only ever used it once and then immediately forgot about it though, but you can do that. I've seen enemies do it, and it's useful to take away from using missiles as it takes away from the lock-on effect, which is very, very useful. There is still a little bit of management and simulation elements in this game. All your weapons effectively create heat, and you can't overheat your mech, so you have to manage which levels of heat you have by firing different weapons that use different values of heat to continue fighting in the middle of a fight, or else you're kind of left unable to attack. But otherwise, it's just a matter of finding your opponent, figuring out what weapon you want to use, managing your heat and boost levels if you've got jump jets, and otherwise it's just run around and shoot everything in sight. And that's a ton of fun. What really surprised me though was just how varied the mission structure to this game was. Because I for the most part kind of just figured it was going to be run around, shoot all the bad guys. And to be fair, there's a lot of that. But there's defense missions, there's a stealth mission, which is, you know, impressive seeing as you're in a giant robot. The stealth mission's actually pretty well done in this game. I was very impressed with it. There's missions where you're entirely on the defensive and they don't completely suck, which is impressive because defense missions in basically any game are terrible. There's no real escort missions though, which is nice. There's one level that kind of frames itself as an escort mission, but it's not really that. You just have to take on some guys that are chasing you and, you know, the mission ends eventually. There's assault, there's capture, there's just so many different types of missions here, and they all feel varied. I was also kind of surprised that some levels are structured in multiple different ways. I ran into this one stage where you could either take a heavy mech and just sort of stomp through and destroy everything, or you could take a lighter mech with some jump jet power and use it to skirt the entire thing, taking out the targets at a distance. I will take points away from this because at the end of the day they also expect you to then jump into the pit and fight the remaining mechs, so ultimately taking the stealthy approach still puts you in just as much danger. But it's interesting that they do give you options in some of the mission structure. I do appreciate that, and it does add a little bit of replayability. It's quite cool like that. There is a total of, I believe, 21 missions in this game, and each one takes about 5 to 10 minutes. I think I ended up beating the game in about 4 or 5 hours. It's not very long, and I think this game was definitely hinging on the fact it was one of the earliest Xbox Live games to get the most gameplay out of it, but it's still a lot of fun. Over the course of the game, you get, I believe, about 6 mechs, but every mech has 2 different sort of weapons loadouts that are labeled as different mechs. So confusingly, the Timberwolf and the Mad Cat are 2 different things in this game, even though, as I've said, this is one of the few Battletech things I actually know. They are the same thing. They're just 2 different names for the same thing. Whereas in this game, they are considered 2 different weapon sets on a similar chassis, effectively. But the interesting thing is the variations of the mechs you get are definitely functionally different. They have different sets of weapons that are effective against different enemies. Some are just I found to be flat out more effective for my fighting style. I never really liked the missiles in this game, but like the rail guns were definitely more my speed. The lasers were pretty effective too. And it's fun just testing out the new different weapon sets on whatever mech you have. If I did have one big complaint about this game, it's that it leans a little too heavily into the arcadey aspects of it and ignores one of the biggest things that makes these sort of mech simulation games so interesting to me, and that is mech customization. Because in this game, you get none of it. You can't modify how much armor your mech has, what sort of power source it's using, weapons on various hard points. Heck, you don't even get to pick your color. They're all predetermined by various loadouts and what specific mech you've got, and that's definitely a little weak, especially because while I don't have a ton of experience with like the PC mech simulation games, I do know that mech customization and weapon packages and stuff, that's a big deal. And that dates all the way back to, you know, the old school tabletop games. So the fact that that entire aspect is kind of outright ignored is just disappointing. What's really interesting though is, of course, that they've got these different mechs all put into different categories, light, medium, and assault, because I guess they didn't want to use the term heavy, because they're all giant robots and they're all heavy, I don't know. But each one fills a different combat role. Light stuff is more or less there for reconnaissance, medium stuff is there to be sort of multi-role, and heavy stuff is just straight on attack. I found the heavier characters a little bit harder to use, honestly, because when the game kind of recognizes that you've got one and they throw you into situations where you should be using them. That's when you're under the most attack, and if you get into a situation where enemies just dump into you, you go down pretty fast no matter how well armored you are. This is a game where you definitely want to fight as much at a distance as possible. In fact, that actually brings up an interesting thing I noticed about the AI, in that it's very, very dumb. It's not going to ignore self-preservation at the end of the day, but it seems to follow a very basic routine of its top priority being to pursue you, and then when it gets sort of a medium range, then it tries to strafe around you to avoid damage. But as long as you keep distance enough that it sort of sticks into that pursuit mode, that's sort of what it focuses on, and you can just sit there and dump into the enemy, and provided you're not like in a giant pit of enemies all targeting you at once, you know, enemies get really dumb and easy to kill in this game. Another thing I noticed about this game, and I really like this little attention to detail, is at least enemies seem to take sectional damage, so if you focus on stuff, you can actually blow off parts. I was fighting this one enemy, and I shot off both his arms, and suddenly he couldn't use his guns. And that was a neat little feature. Moreover, when you start damaging them more and more, they start limping around and showing damage in certain areas. I can't prove that this game has a sectional damage system because it doesn't seem to, at least in regards to the player, but it does affect your opponents, and it does seem to actually affect genuinely how they operate, and that's cool. And likewise, when you take them out, they explode. And when they explode, they take out everything near them. You can actually daisy chain enemies killed by just a death explosion, and it will basically take out anything, so you can't be too close to your opponents in this game. Even though that does seem to be a viable strategy when going up against stuff with missiles. For some reason, they just can't go after things that are too close. But either way, stay away from things that are blowing up, or you will die embarrassingly. I've done that before. But it was a neat little feature all the same, and it creates a viable way to take out multiple opponents at once, which is really genuinely cool. It's such a small detail that has such a big impact, and I appreciated that immensely. And likewise, as you damage enemies and they take more and more damage, you can actually see bits of them glow like they're overheating and they're about to go like critical. And that's just such a neat little visual touch that shows that you're definitely doing something to your opponents. The visuals in this game definitely lend to understanding how damaged your opponents are, and that's masterful. Overall, I think if you're looking for the more simulation-y side of mech games, you're probably not going to find it here, but if you want a fun, mechy third-person shooter on the Xbox that isn't Phantom Crash or Metal Wolf Chaos, let's just be honest here, I think those two are still better. Phantom Crash is amazing, go watch that video, but this one is definitely a must-have, as is its sequel. It's not perfect, and it doesn't exactly fall entirely in the simulation aspect, which I think is probably a letdown to the fans of that, but it's still a mechy, fun, good time. The overall presentation to Mechassault is decent, but it has some pretty glaring issues, I found. On the good end is the visuals. All the mechs look visually distinct and have a really solid silhouette, so you can kind of tell what you're fighting at a distance, which is appreciated. And one really nice little tiny detail I noticed, but when you're playing in a stage in the snow, they actually have a separate texture for your mechs in the snow. Like, they have a snow built up layer on top of your mech, which I thought was just such a nice small detail that really made it feel immersive. Like, just the tiniest detail, but really appreciated. All the stages tend to have their own unique feel, and even areas that take place in the same region and have a similar texture set for the world, you know, they feel like they were designed with enough individual stage design to at least make it feel a little bit different from everything else. The topography always feels different, the buildings feel different, and the mechs feel very different visually. And it's nice that even though you're kind of only getting half the mechs, seeing as half the mechs are just, you know, a weapon swap of the mechs you have, they do get a different color scheme, so you can at least visually tell the difference between them, which is good. On the audio side of things, though, things are a lot less good. For one thing, there's basically no audio in this game. Like, there's some music when you select a mech, and there's one or two bits in game. Whenever you run into like an actual mech, you start getting like this kind of generic but rather kickin' guitar riff, which is nice. But in between that, you're just left with kind of quietness, and I guess that's just supposed to be atmospheric and to build tension, but there's not really all that much to speak of in terms of audio, in terms of the overall soundtrack, because there's just not all that much that's really there or notable. And while the voice acting is certainly done well enough, I noticed one weird thing, and I don't know if it's a problem I have with my disc or just that the audio engineers did something weird with this game or something, but half the voice dialogues cut really abruptly and in weird places, almost like they had longer lines that just got cut down in really bad places. It makes the like actual voice acting seem a little bit shoddy by comparison, just because it cuts in and out at weird times, and it just feels like it wasn't really edited properly. And I think that does bring down the audio presentation a fair bit. I think the audio in general is definitely the weaker side of the presentation of this game, but visually it's alright. Now, if you want a copy of Mechassault on the Xbox, bear in mind this is one of those games that is not backwards compatible on anything, unlike the sequel, which was. Cheapest one I'm seeing on eBay right now, $2. That is $2 well spent. I don't think this is perfect. I think the audio is an issue, and it could just stand to be more, honestly. But the fact is that the game itself is solid, the campaign is fantastically varied in its stage design, and the mechs you pilot are all a lot of fun, and they all feel different. There's also a sequel that's also fairly affordable on the Xbox. Cheapest copy of that I'm seeing right now is like $5. And from what I remember, I haven't played through that one to its entirety, but from what I remember, the sequel was a lot better, but it was still a ton of fun. And these two games are great. There was also a DS game. I don't think I've ever met anyone who's ever played it. I don't think I've ever even seen a copy of it, but, oh, and this was gonna be on the Gizmondo. Oh wait, that's not a positive thing. Either way, Mechassault on the Xbox was an interesting console iteration of the Mechwarrior series. There haven't been many of those. Like I said, the second one came out, and the most recent one has as well, and I've been playing that on my Android device, and that game's a lot of fun as well, although it's a lot slower and a lot more simulation-y. But I have to admit, as a way to get console players into the Mechwarrior series, I think Mechassault's pretty solid. It's a fun, varied campaign with some great mechs, and a pretty fun story, and some solid acting. The only real issues come from how that presentation was handled, and even so, I think it's kind of just average at best. But still, it's solid, and I think that for the cheap cost of $2, Mechassault is a must-have for the Xbox library, especially if you're a fan of mechs. But definitely go out and get Phantom Crash first, because that game only has 3 levels, but that game is amazing. And then maybe go get the remake of Metal Wolves that isn't ridiculously expensive. But, you know, for one of the few Mechwarrior games I've ever had a chance to play, I had a lot of fun with Mechassault, and I would highly recommend it.